Hello, my name is John Rose, and in this video I'd like to tell you guys about some of my cooked food experiments. I've done a total of 5 cooked food experiments over the course of my 26 years of being a raw vegan, and only one of those deals with the first 5 years where I was not 100% raw. I averaged 90% for that time period. And in 1994, in my 4th year, I decided to do a 30-day cooked food experiment. And I did it because I wanted to try to make some sense out of all the conflicting information I was reading about the best way to eat raw food. Do we have to be 100%? Is 80% okay? So I said, well, let me test it out on myself. Let's see what happens. And I mainly did this test because I had a theory. Because I was noticing that I would go for months eating raw food, and all of a sudden I'd slip up and eat some cooked food, and I'd gain weight immediately from that. And my theory was that the cooked food was going back and filling up bad spots in my colon that I'd cleaned out when I did some juice fast. You see, when you drink nothing but juice, which is the first of my 3-step process, and it's in the description box below if you're interested in going to a seminar I did, and I'll reference back to that throughout the video, as I always do. You can learn more about it there. But when I started doing these juice fast, or whenever you do a juice fast, you will clean things out of your system, and if you go long enough, you'll clean out some really old spots. And for me, I had a bunch of herniated blowouts on the side of the walls of my colon. They call them diverticula. And if you have a bunch of them, they call it diverticulosis. And once it reached the inflammation stage, they changed the name of it because it's in a different stage now. It's diverticulitis. Itis meaning inflammation. So I estimated I had about 100 of those herniated blowouts on the sides of my colon wall. And what would happen is I would adhere to a raw vegan diet for months and not have any problems. I'll monitor my weight, and then I'd eat something pretty innocent like some steamed broccoli or a baked potato, and all of a sudden I could gain a couple pounds. And then yet it only represented a few hundred calories. And of course I learned very quickly what was happening because I would go on another juice fast and I would eliminate those little herniated blowouts once again. Same shape as the other ones that came out in when they first came out, but when they first came out they were really hard and dry, and the second ones, the next time they came out, which it happened over and over actually, because I wasn't 100% for a long time, and I made this mistake over and over and over, and gained weight and got rid of it, and gained it and got rid of it, but every time it came back out, it looked like those little same shapes. So I realized I had a damaged system, and I was forced into not eating cooked food. Otherwise, I'd have to keep cleaning up the mess I was making, and I was aware of it because I was documenting everything. So what happens when I went back to eating cooked food in the beginning, I would fill up those spaces. So what I did in 1994 is I did an experiment. I said, let's see what happens if I take a big step back to where I'm at now and eat 1 cooked meal a day. And let me test out some of these theories. They say you don't have to be 100%. Let's try 80%. So I did that. And I'm documenting everything. I'm right at that 80% number. I figured out exactly what I could eat to make that be 20 and 80. And sure enough, what happened to me in this cooked food experiment, my first one, is in the first 20 days I gained 17 pounds. Now that's a lot of extra calories and fat if that's what it was, but it wasn't. It was all colon weight, and I know it was. And what was interesting about this 30-day cooked food experiment is that from day 21 to day 30, I didn't gain any extra weight. So my first 30-day experiment confirmed my theory or my suspicions that the cooked food was going back and filling up those old spots. And I know this to be true because I go on another juice cleanse, and sure enough, those 17 pounds came right out of me immediately. Immediately, they came right out. And sure enough, they were the same shape and everything else that I saw before. So that forced me to be 100%. That realization made me realize I have a damaged system. I can't get away with violating the law of nature without nature really slapping me and saying, hey, that's not right. So I went for a long time until I did my next cooked food experiment. And it was about 17 years later, about 5 years ago or so, I decided to duplicate that experiment. I was wanting to do that because I had finished one of my many books that I've written that basically tell the same story with a different title and a different approach, with the design to appeal to people who know nothing at all about any of this. But like every book I've written so far trying to do this, I'm not happy with any one of their approaches. I don't think any one of them are going to be the book that can wake up the masses. But anyway, when I did that book back in 2011, I said, well, I really should duplicate this experiment one more time because I have another theory. In 17 years, I think my system has healed itself. Let's do another 30-day experiment. Let's go back to 80% raw, 20% cooked, and let's see what happens. Let's see if I gain any weight. And guess what? My theory and suspicions were confirmed once again. I didn't gain any weight. I go, yay, I'm healed. Now I really understand what's going on. But I sure don't want to go back to cook food. I didn't like that experience at all. It was horrible. And what did I do? Of course, is I go into another juice fast. Because I usually juice fast or feast or take a solid food vacation once a year maybe. Sometimes I'll go 2 years, but I usually go at least 30 days. And I've done it for over 1,200 days in the last 24 years altogether. So I really have a lot of experience and knowledge about this because I document everything, so I can always go back and look at things. So what I did after that second cooked food experiment many years later is I finally compared the two and I go, wait a second, as a scientist I really didn't duplicate what I had done. I intentionally avoided potatoes when I did my first cooked food experiment, which was nothing but soup. That's all I did. I added cooked vegetable soup to my routine. And it was very innocent, like squash and green beans and onions and things like that. So it was easy to go through my system and it didn't plug anything up. However, I could do that long ago when my system was really damaged, and that was bad enough to fill up those spots. But it didn't happen the second time I did this, and then I realized once again, I didn't do any potatoes. And potatoes are starchy. And they're the least nutritious of all the vegetables if you base it on calories because they're high in calories. So from that standpoint, they're actually good. It's funny when you look at Joel Fuhrman's way of looking at nutrient density and basing everything on calories. Sometimes having more calories can be a plus. But then it makes everything also look like it's inferior because we're basing it on calories. Anyway, I decided to do another cooked food experiment the next year. And I said, let me do some potatoes. Let me throw some potatoes into the soup. I'll even try some baked potatoes like I did before. And yay, guess what? I was able to handle the baked potatoes. But I didn't like it. I didn't like the way it made me feel. It was a major letdown, but I could sure see the attraction because it was like being sedated. And I understood this concept because when you go from a dead cooked food to a live living food, you don't get that dead sedated feeling, which many of us really like because we live in a sick world and it feels good to be sedated, doesn't it? And then if you're used to it every day, you are addicted to it, and you'll have withdrawals if you don't have it. But anyway, just like the cooked food experiment the year before, I did the same thing. I go into a juice fast, and that's the best way to deal with cooked food addictions. And if anybody's going to tell you cooked food is not addictive, they're in a major state of denial because of all the addictions out there, you can't find one stronger. Any food-related addiction is going to be harder than any other addiction like smoking or drugs because you don't need the drugs, but you need the food. So any addiction related to food is going to be one of the most difficult addictions to break. But then cooked food is by far the biggest one of all. That's why Plato said, whatever deceives men seems to produce a magical enchantment. And that's what cooked food does. It puts us under a spell. Now it's the hunger spell where now we crave that cooked food. So with both of my experiments, I knew to break that addiction immediately, unwind that cable, and go right into a juice fast. Well, after those two cooked food experiments in the last 5 years, I didn't want to do any more, but then a year later after that, 2 years after that actually, I was coaching a woman and she was asking me what I thought about adding beans into her diet, which is what Joel Fuhrman is now recommending. And it's really sad to see what a man will do with a family and children in order to increase his business by soft selling his message to appeal to more people. It's a shame what money does to people, or just out of desperation thinking, I'm better off sugarcoating my message a little bit if I can appeal to more people because then it'll still help more people. And there's a little bit of logic behind that. However, you should still include what the ideal is to give people a standard to aim at. But anyway, I decided, well, it's time to do another cooked food experiment. And of course, when the woman asked me about the beans, I told her what I had read before about beans being one of the most difficult plants to digest, because you got a food that's relatively high in protein and you got that starch, and that's not a good combination. Plus the fact that we have to cook it or sprout it to eat it means we weren't really meant to eat it. Sprouting it might be a whole different game, but cooking it definitely is a big mistake, because I did another, that's my next cooked food experiment. I decided to go ahead and test what would happen if I ate beans for 30 days. And it turned out it did make me gain weight, only because of the bowel transit time and the difficulty in digesting that food. And as a result, I weighed a couple pounds more. I didn't accumulate old stuff like I'd done long ago, so I still knew my colon was healed, but I still learned that that food was not meant to be consumed. Because I'm monitoring everything going in and everything coming out, and I see what happens when you cook your food and you eat foods that are hard to digest. So I was able to eat soups with easy to digest foods and get rid of those quick enough where I didn't gain weight, but not so with the beans. Now, the following year, I've done one more experiment. I look back at all of my experiments, because once I do these experiments, I compare them. I do a comparative analysis. I look at all my notes, and I look at all of them. I look for similarities to try to make some sense out of this. And I realized, or I thought of rather, what they've done recently in France several years ago when they did some studies on GMOs. And they said, you know what, all these studies on GMOs are only going 4 weeks. Let's go a little bit longer, let's see what happens. Well, when they made it to the 6-week mark, all the rats developed tumors. So there's a reason why they cut all those experiments off at 4 weeks, because they knew what would happen if they went longer. So I realized that, well, maybe I didn't go long enough, so I extended this last cooked food experiment to 3 months. And the same thing happened to me. I never gained any extra weight other than the amount of weight that it took to process those foods on a temporary basis. And then once I finished that, I immediately went into another juice fast. And that's the best way to break that cooked food addiction. And once we go back to cooked food, this is a hard addiction to break. And the easiest way to break any addiction is fasting. That's why it's mentioned in the Bible 74 times. It allows us to take control over things that are controlling us. Unfortunately, water fasting is not always a safe thing to do for a lot of people. And a lot of people just don't have the luxury to take off from work and family responsibilities and say, okay, I'm going to do nothing but lay in bed for the next 6 weeks. If you do a 3-week fast and you got to recover 3 weeks. But when you do a juice fast, or a juice feast, or a solid food vacation, the way I've designed it, you can still work and work more efficiently, have more energy, and then you'll have the nutrients that you'll need to help eliminate or neutralize and eliminate any environmental toxins that you might have that you don't get on a water fast. Again, I put the link down below in the description box on how to do the first of a 3-step process that I perfected. And what we want to do is simply test it to make sure that it's true. And when you do, my friends, I can guarantee you, you're in for a treat.